Some of those were really hard for me to hear, but I'm really thankful they were willing to share their experiences. See, that's the thing about stories. They help you see things that you wouldn't have seen or think about something in a way you might not have before. No matter where you fit into all of this, I'm glad you heard these stories. First, so you can know you're not alone in what you're thinking, feeling, or experiencing. See, each person's story is equally important. Each person in these stories we just heard looked different from each other. They all had a completely different experience when it comes to race, but they also all shared something in common. They were all affected by racial tension in real and significant ways. We've only shared a few stories today, but there are so many others we could have heard on this topic. You might even be able to think of a few more examples yourself. Like, what about the story of someone who was unkind? Someone who treated others from different races unfairly? Where do they fit into this? Maybe you've heard someone talking about another race in a negative way. Maybe you've even had negative thoughts about other races because of the things you've heard, seen, or experienced. Those stories are important to talk about too. See, when it comes to race, sometimes our differences cause people to think of others as less than or themselves as better, which is known as bias. If we aren't careful, bias can lead us to treat others differently or poorly, and that's discrimination. When we treat others worse because of a bias, it can cause incredible pain, and ultimately, it can create more racial tension in our world. And here's the truth I want you to know today. Our differences in race don't have to mean something negative. In fact, they shouldn't mean something negative. Why? Well, because God designed race to be a beautiful and unique representation of who God is. Here's how I know. In the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, we get the details of how God created the world. One by one, God made everything we see and experience in the world. And then God made people. And here's what the writer of Genesis said about that. So God created mankind in his own image. Out of all the things God created, people are who reflect God's image. Reflecting God's image means when people see you, they see more of who God is. They see more of who God is in the way you act, the way you talk, the way you treat others, and the way that you are uniquely you. The word mankind in this verse is so important because it means all of humankind. That means there isn't just one person, one group, or one race that better reflects God's image than any other. There isn't one race that points to God more than any other. In fact, together we reflect the image of God. And that's pretty amazing. But unfortunately, you and I both know that sometimes the world doesn't see it this way. Because even though God made each of us to uniquely reflect that image, not all people act as if that's true. Some people treat people of other races like they don't belong. Some people use hurtful words or language toward people who don't look like them. Some people act out in anger or even hate towards other races. And not only do those things cause more racial tension in our world, they're also not reflecting or respecting the image of God in each other. So, what do we do about it? If together we reflect the image of God, then how can we better understand how to treat one another like that's true? I think we can find our answer in Jesus. See, knowing Jesus changes everything. It changes the way we see ourselves and others, and it changes the way we treat the people around us, those who look like us and those who don't. During his time on earth, Jesus showed us what it looks like to treat all people with value and respect. He constantly stood up for and helped people who are hurt, abused, or treated unfairly simply because of who they were. And in doing that, Jesus was not only reflecting God's love to the world, but he was also setting the example for how we should all treat each other too. One of Jesus' followers talked about this in a letter that we can read in the Bible today. I think it's safe to say that this guy knew Jesus pretty well because he was actually Jesus' brother, James. Like Jesus, James grew up in a culture where some people were treated better than others. It was normal. It was so common that they may not have even noticed they were doing it. But because James knew Jesus, he knew there was a better way. So let's take a look at what he said. My dear brothers and sisters, how can you claim to have faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ if you favor some people over others? When James used that word, favor, he was talking about something similar to bias. So basically, James was saying, how can you say you follow Jesus but still treat some people like they're better than others? Because James knew Jesus set the example. And if we say we have faith in Jesus and want to follow him, then how we treat people really matters. When we act out of bias or do things that contribute to the racial tension in this world, we're not reflecting what following Jesus really looks like to the world around us. James went on to say this, yes, indeed, it is good when you obey the royal law as found in the scriptures. Love your neighbor as yourself. But if you favor some people over others, you are committing a sin. You are guilty of breaking the law. That royal law that James was talking about is part of what Jesus called the greatest or most important commandment, to love our neighbors as ourselves. In other words, to treat people the way we want to be treated. So, if we wouldn't want to be judged by the color of our skin, we shouldn't judge others that way. If it would hurt us to be called names simply because of who we are, then we shouldn't use those names toward others. If we wouldn't want to be left out because of our race, then we shouldn't leave others out because of their race. And if we'd want someone to stand up for us, then we need to stand up for the people we see being treated unfairly because of their race. When we follow that command to love our neighbor as ourselves, we are honoring the image of God in them and in ourselves. And if we don't, well, James said that any favor or bias we might show towards others is actually a sin. That means it's something that goes directly against the way Jesus tells us to live. So, when it comes to racial tension in our world, we have a responsibility. First, to see and respect the image of God in every human being. And second, as followers of Jesus, to treat others the way we want to be treated. Because remember, knowing Jesus changes everything. It makes us different. And that means even if racial tension seems common in our world, it can't be common with us. Remember, together we reflect the image of God. That means every person, no matter their age, gender, or race, is important and should be treated with respect. Now, if you've been hurt or mistreated because of your race, I want you to know that's awful. And that is not okay. The pain you feel is real. I'm so sorry that's how you've been treated. And I want you to know that here, that's not okay. We are committed to making this a safe place for you to talk about your experiences and to find people who are willing to walk with you and stand beside you through it. And if you're someone who hasn't experienced any bias or poor treatment because of your race, you may feel that this is difficult to understand. Maybe, like the people James wrote to, you never really noticed this before. Or maybe you're someone who's trying to change the way you treat people, or even change your mind about the bias you might have had in the past. That's amazing, and I'm so glad that you're here too, because we want you to be part of this conversation with us. It's so important to listen to people who are willing to share their stories like the ones we heard today. Stories that help us learn and grow and change and understand. So, remember those stories we listened to earlier? I want to go back to those for a minute. Let's hear more of what was learned along the way.